Heather, and welcome back. It's been a couple weeks since I've been with you, and I thought it's a really good time to talk about change. We're wrapping up the school year, we're getting into summer. As parents, we're possibly dealing with some changes that are coming up. Maybe your kid's going into kindergarten next year for the first time, or maybe your kid's going into middle school or high school, or like me, you're experiencing your last child graduate from high school, thinking about college, dreaming about her future, and then also other changes that are coming, like I'm going to be a grandmother soon. And what is that going to look like? And what is that going to be like? And change is just part of being a human being. But sometimes change can feel a lot like grief. Change can really bring up unexpected emotions, both what we would consider positive emotions and what might define as negative emotions. And I want to talk about that because I think it's important to kind of get it in the room. When we experience change and it triggers grief or loss in us, our first inclination might be to squash it because it feels so impractical. It feels illogical. We should just be able to accept change and be good with it. And so we kind of put some blame on ourselves for feeling what we feel. And as an emotional health coach, I can tell you right now that is not a good place to start, because the one thing I know for sure is that the emotions will always come out. They may not come out at the right time, and they'll probably come out sideways. So it might be better to just deal with them from the beginning, right? That's what I'm all about. So let's take a look at the content today. When change feels like grief and loss. And I've talked about grief before, and so I'm bringing in some charts from my grief presentations, but change can feel a lot like grief and loss. So there's a author, David Kessler. Now he is a well-known author and specialist regarding grief. He worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who I will reference later in the slides. But he is just a renowned person on the topic of grief, renowned author and teacher and expert, and has a lot to share. And I love this quote: "Life gives us pain. Our job is to experience it when it gets handed to us. Avoidance of loss has a cost." We cannot avoid that life is going to give us pain. We cannot avoid that something's going to be delivered to our front door that we do not want. That we do not want to accept that special delivery of whatever it is, because it gets handed to us. We are not in control of what shows up at the door, and we are not in control of what's handed to us. But what we are in control of is our emotional response and our reaction. And you can see here David references a reaction. Avoidance is common, but it has a cost. So what's so good about grief? I cannot help but talk about grief and except imagining Charlie Brown and him with that puzzled look on his face of good grief, like how can this be happening? And so I want to bring some levity and some humor into it, because this is a heavy subject. And grief is part of being a human being. And so coming to kind of embrace grief and loss um, feels really, really challenging on certain days, and on other days it feels easier for me. So I just imagine Charlie Brown, his puzzled face, his confusion, and just saying good grief. And there's something about the word good that's in front of grief that kind of brings some levity and some humor to situations when I'm feeling that really strong, hard emotion, the emotions that surround grief. And we're going to get to those feelings here in a bit. But I think this is a great place to start that opens up that place of curiosity in me, that enables me to listen in to myself, to observe a situation from a different angle, to do some self-discovery, and that self-discovery often really kind of goes out to really seeing a situation from a new perspective, or a new concept that I wouldn't have before if I had stayed or avoided those kind of icky, yucky emotions. All right, I want to remind us about the brain and kind of what happens. Now, this is just a part of our body, right? I don't want to ever ignore the neck down body, because that is really our greatest wisdom. But the brain kind of responds to scary situations or icky, yucky, difficult, ouchy situations with three questions. The first question it asks is, am I safe? Gonna happen every time. It's just the way it is. Am I safe? And this is where we experience temperature changes, fast heart rate, that fight or flight feeling, that sense of urgency. We have to do something now. So to feel safe, the brain always wants to ask, am I safe? And if I'm safe, if I feel that sense of safe, the next question it might ask concurrently is, am I loved? Do I feel loved and supported in connection in the relationships in my life? And it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. That context could be working at a certain organization with a certain group of people, or a family dynamic where it's your family situation at home, or maybe it's at a community event or a nonprofit you work for. But all of these things kind of come together when hard, icky situations trigger emotions. Am I safe and am I loved kind of happen concurrently. And if am I safe is a hard no, we're not going any further. We're not going to go to am I loved. We're just going to get the heck out of there. When we start asking the question, am I loved? Do I feel connection? Do I feel connection to the people that I'm with in order to be vulnerable and express how I'm feeling? And the third question, which is really where the magic happens, is what can I learn from this? That's why we do reflection. That's where the writing prompts come in that I offer at the end of my segments. Just that reflection to really do some deeper work of self-discovery, to answer the questions, am I loved and am I safe? And what was going on with me when I felt safe or I didn't feel safe? And what was going on with me and how did I respond when I felt loved or when I didn't feel loved? And what can I learn from all of this? So those are kind of the three big questions that the brain asks, right? All right. Grief indicates that we are alive. So I always say, when I talk about grief, welcome to being a human being. Grief is part of a lived experience. When we are fully alive, we also fully grieve. There's many quotes that I've heard that are helpful, but when we have loved deeply, we will grieve deeply. It's the same coin. Grief is really the other side of the coin of love. You know, one side is love and all the beautiful things that come with it, and then and the connection and the safety and the warmth. And then the other side of the coin is the loss of that safety, warmth, and connection, because that is simply part of being a human and experiencing disconnection or loss from a relationship that is either by death or by other changes, right? Grief is not dedicated to just when people die. Things die all the time in our lives. And acknowledging those is a really great, big, healthy first step to self-awareness, self-discovery, self-compassion, and self-love. So grief indicates that we are alive. So welcome to being a living human. To be alive and human, right? To be a human and alive naturally includes connection. Why? Because I always say humans, we were made for connection. We were made to be in relationship with other human beings. We were not made to be like Tom Hanks on the island with a soccer ball that, you know, he personified as a person, because that's humans need other humans to survive. We work together in villages and in communities. And so the earliest kind of beginning of human experience was a collective. It is only now in the kind of post-enlightenment and modern age where we've gone to a more individualistic culture, especially in the West. But humans, just bottom line, are made for connection, okay? And so to be alive and human includes connection with other humans. And when connection is lost, for whatever reason, we grieve. We're going to feel sad. We're going to feel sorrow. We're going to feel all sorts of feelings that come with grief and grieving. And I think it's important to break those down. So when connection is lost, we grieve it. So I want you to think about these topics. Perhaps there's a career change. Perhaps someone is retiring from an organization, or maybe they're being promoted and they're leaving your team that you've worked with for a long time. Perhaps you've decided to retire. Perhaps you're coming to the end of a career and you're both excited and scared all at the same time. Career is a big, big part of our lives. Our work, our meaning, our purpose is wrapped up in that one word, career. So it takes important attention to pay attention to what comes up around career when we're going through change. Friendships. Now, friendships change all the time. What we don't always do is acknowledge it. What we don't always do is actually walk through both the beginning of a friendship and the ending of a friendship. That there is a life cycle to friendships and they change all the time, but we don't always bring attention to it. So if a friendship has changed or is changing, what are the emotions of grief that are coming up around that for you? And are you being attentive to that? Not so much fixing it, just putting attention on it. And of course, romantic relationships. Those are some of the most intimate relationships we have. You may have some friendships that are truly intimate, but there's something about romantic relationships and like family or parent-child relationships that will trigger some deeper wound emotions that are wounds that haven't been healed yet from our past, from our earliest years of childhood, right? So those intimate relationships will trigger those older emotions or older wounds of abandonment or perhaps not being seen, not being heard. Family is a big one. Family dynamics, family changes, loss of family members, of course, aging, aging parents, dealing with medical issues, medical conditions of family or yourself. Those are things that we grieve. We can grieve the loss of our health when we have a diagnosis or we receive some news from a doctor, or we just simply are getting older and our body is changing. And so it's normal to feel things, emotions that are that grief holds around that, okay? Here's a couple more places. So this is one we don't always think about, but we feel it. You've felt it before, perhaps when you've moved to a new place and you feel that sense of excitement and fear, perhaps, or anxiety, or just sadness, or just kind of a longing for what was totally normal. So moving, but also simply as changing offices. If they move you to a new building, you're going to miss that place. You're going to remember what that was like. Your body was used to being in that space. And so it's normal to feel that sadness or grief. Same with teleworking. We just got through a pandemic or still going through the pandemic. And 2 years in, our worlds were turned upside down. And a lot of the time we couldn't even identify what we were feeling when we were just missing the places where we'd always been, where we'd always been able to go without restriction. And that changed. And that brought up a lot of emotion that maybe were not addressed, right? And so if we don't address our emotions, remember I said they're going to come out sideways. They're going to always come out. It's like being in a pool with little plastic balls trying to hold them all down. They're going to start popping up. You're not going to be able to keep them under the water, right? They're going to start showing up until you deal with them. And then this is a big one, kids who are becoming adults. Graduation, going to college graduation, moving out, getting married, starting their own families. Parents, it's normal to have that empty nest syndrome, that feeling, that grieving that change brings. Again, all of these are normal, and these are just a few. So when connection is lost, and I want to emphasize this, we grieve it. When connection is lost with a career, if you are no longer going to be in a career at a specific place, you move away, you're going to grieve. Same thing with your kids moving out of your home, graduating high school, those big transition moments, a family member that has to be put into an assisted living facility, a family member that has to sell their home because of health issues. Um, a family that has to move away, a family member that maybe is aging and is going through some things that are changing the way that they live in the world. They can no longer drive, or you can no longer drive, or all the things that come with change. We grieve those things, and it's important to pay attention to what we're feeling. So, what feelings come up with those? As you're thinking about it, which one resonates for you, and what feelings come up? So I want to point out the feeling wheel and just kind of point out some feelings. So typically we might feel disgust or things associated with that. Like we might want to avoid. And in avoidance, there's aversion or hesitancy to talk about the feelings. But I want to talk about the next door neighbors the most. So sometimes the next door neighbor between anger, the next door neighbors of disgust is anger and sadness. So look at how sometimes there's overlap where we can pay attention to, maybe I am feeling really wanting to distance and withdraw from a situation that's going on. Maybe my parent is going through a health crisis and my siblings are really wanting us to get all this done. And I'm feeling kind of a little bit withdrawn. I'm feeling distant. I'm not sure, and I'm kind of feeling angry, but I'm not really sure what it is, and I don't want to engage on it because there's a part of me that perhaps wants to avoid have disgust. Not disgust sounds so bad, but really avoidance is kind of just saying, "Oh, this is just too much for me," and I want to withdraw. So the neighboring emotions are really going to be helpful to help you identify even more in self discovery of what you're feeling. And the goal is to name it. That's what we're doing here. Another thing we might feel is anger, like I just said, right? So, anger, some of these emotions might come up. We might feel resentful of what's going on, of the change, resentful of, well, why did they have to break our team up? Or why did they have to do the reorg? Or why did my siblings have to push the issue with going into with mom having to go to this place and sell the house? We might be feeling heartbroken or embarrassed or even just like irritated. But you can see how there's a big gamut of anger. So naming that, I'm feeling angry, and I think that anger is showing up as feeling irritated or withdrawn or just skeptical of everything that's going on with this change. I'm suspicious of why this is being done. Kind of those concepts. So here's sad, right? So sad is a big one, right? Where we might feel empty or powerless or isolated. Change sometimes makes us feel like we're if our kids are going away to college, I'm going to be alone. I'm going to feel isolated and lonely, and there's sadness that comes up with that, right? But look at the neighboring emotion to sad is happy. On the other side is disgust, right? So we have options. So sometimes when we're sad, we might go to the disgust side where we want to avoid or even perhaps feel disappointed, in what's going on. But then on the other side, there could also be this sense of inspiration and openness, optimism, even around the change, and that we can leverage those emotions in order to be able to fully access that we actually might be feeling maybe a little sensitive or hopeful. We may be feeling, a little bit kind of vulnerable, but in that vulnerability, we might be able to access the optimism of, oh, I've been through this before. Remembering the times I've been through something like this before and what can come, right? What can come from that? Another area is fear around change, which is totally normal. We might feel scared, anxious, insecure. Our anxiety may be just worry of what's going to come with this change. What is going to be my responsibility? How is it going to change how I relate to this person? Like in a friendship, for example, what would it be like to not be with my friend on her birthday or his birthday? Um, I'm going to miss that. I'm scared of what that might feel like. You may even feel a little bit of like rejection, feeling inadequate. Um, if this person doesn't want to be friends with me, am I worth being friends with? Those are the questions we kind of ask ourselves, or the self-talk that can come along. But we want to name it, because naming it is really where we get our power. I also want to point out that with the scared, your neighboring emotion is surprise, right? So look at that in the sense of how fear, surprise, and happy can come together. So paying attention to the neighbor of, I feel fear, I'm scared, but I wonder sometimes, is there an element of surprise where we're maybe feeling a little bit dismayed or disillusioned, confused? And then you can even see how excitement can almost feel like fear. Excitement can feel scary. So there's a lot to go with that. And then into the liberated, kind of ecstatic, joyful place that it can be both. We can always do both. Both things can exist at the same time. Both being scared and joyful can exist at the same time. So the power is naming the emotions. So as you think about this concept, and you can look at the slides later because I'm going to make sure I post it on social, but whether it's career, friendships, romantic relationships, changes with your kids going into adulthood, changes with your kid going into middle school, going into kindergarten, changes with your spouse, for example, a career change, a physical location, just simply moving to another state. What are the feelings that come up? And what were the feeling neighbors that resonated? So when you look at that feeling wheel, and you can Google feeling wheel, you don't have to use mine, you can find a plethora of them to use to help you identify those feelings. It is helpful to have somebody facilitate. I can tell you that right now. And that's what I do, is really kind of help facilitate and walk through that. But you can certainly do this on your own for your own journey and your own self-discovery. And then I want you to ask a question. What do you think you need right now? As you've thought about whatever the topic is that you're grieving, that you're feeling those feelings around change, what do you need right now? You might need to sit with this one for a little while. You might need to just journal it. You might need to talk to someone about it. Reach out to a therapist or a coach like myself. What do you need to feel supported? What do you need for your brain to feel safe, to feel loved, so that you are able to go into a place of reflection? Asking for what we need is the hardest thing for people to do, because it feels like we are being vulnerable, that we have needs, but welcome to being a human. We all have needs. So, what do you think you need right now? Like in a career situation, if you're going through a career transition or something's happening at work and you're feeling grief around the change, what do you need in order to work your way through that? You might need to talk to someone. You might need to talk to your supervisor and just say, I'm feeling this way. You may even be able to say to a group of people you feel safe with, I feel sad that this is happening, or I'm excited, but I'm scared. What is it going to do? What's the impact going to be? Change is tricky. What do you think you need right now? This is a great quote from David Kessler. Each person's grief is as unique as their fingerprint. No one is alike, okay? No comparing. Everyone's grief is unique. But what everyone has in common is that no matter how they grieve, they share a need for their grief to be witnessed. There is something powerful about being in a room with someone and saying, I'm feeling sad about this change. I'm feeling loss. You know, when my daughter graduates high school this weekend and she does that ceremony, that like transition, that ceremony has such a rite of passage feeling. To be able to say, I'm going to feel loss, what's going to happen, what's going to change, and to have somebody just hear that and say, I can imagine that feels overwhelming. I can imagine that feels like exciting but scary. Um, we all need to be witnessed. Grief needs to be expressed and witnessed. That doesn't mean needing someone to try to lessen it or reframe it for them. So, no fixing allowed. When we're witnessing someone else share their expression about change or grief, we don't need to try to fix it or make it better. The need is for someone to be fully present to the magnitude of their loss without trying to point out the silver lining, which is tough because, we all like to fix, mostly because we don't. It reminds us of our own pain and our own grief. And so we want to fix other people's stuff because we don't want to deal with our own pain. So learning how to deal with your wounds is going to help you show up compassionately for someone who is walking through their own grief about change or loss in their life. This is the Kubler-Ross grief cycle, and I want to point it out because this is something that most people recognize, the cycle of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And she came up with these five phases of grief. Now, she has it kind of like this picture depicts it as a wave. I would even depict it as a spiral that if you see what a spiral is like, it has up and down, up and down. Grief is it is not linear. It is kind of all over the place. So she discovered the first, these five phases of grief, and she used this to frame her therapeutic teaching, her education, her mentoring, her expertise on grief and what the phases are that are not linear. They're not in order. They can come at any time in the cycle. But David Kessler has recently added a sixth phase. Now, David Kessler worked very close with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and he has written really, really some wonderful, fantastic books, um, regarding her work and with her talking about death and dying. It's just remarkable. But the sixth phase he has added is finding meaning in grief. And here's the bottom line. To find meaning means we allow ourselves to come to a place of accepting the fact that we're grieving. So in the grieving process, there is a phase called acceptance. However, the sixth phase is having the courage to understand that you're in the grieving process and to accept that in and of itself, that finding meaning in the whole big picture of grief is powerful and profound, and it takes a lot of courage and vulnerability and resilience to show up that way for yourself and to accept that grief is. So it is normal, to wrap it up, it is normal to grieve change. Normal. Your loss is the worst loss, no matter the size or weight of it. It is. Avoid comparisons. Please don't compare your grief. Remember that quote just a minute ago. Your grief is as unique as your fingerprint. This is your journey, and you have permission to fully feel all of it. Another thing that's helpful is to name the change that feels like loss. So naming it, naming the thing that is triggering that loss, that grief around it, and sit with the emotions that come up, right? We just talked about the emotions, sit with the emotions, and then do the work of reflection. So your loss is not a test, a lesson, something to handle, a gift, or a blessing. Loss is simply what happens to you in life. Meaning is what you make happen. And I can replace the word loss with change. Your change is not a test, a lesson, something to handle, a gift, or a blessing. Change is simply what happens to you in life. Meaning is what you make happen. So change happens to us, but the meaning that we make of that change and the loss and grief we may feel surrounding that change is what makes meaning for us and helps us gain perspective, embrace vulnerability, access ourselves in a more meaningful way, compassionately show up for others, empathy, presence with ourselves and with others. It's truly a profound thing when we look at it this way, that it's not something that is being done to you with intent. It just happens. Change, loss, grief, it just happens. And meaning is what I can make happen. You can make happen. So here are the writing prompts. When change feels like loss, grief, and loss. Writing prompts part 1. So a recent situation when change, big or small, felt like loss, sadness, sorrow, grief, was. You would fill in the blank. In this situation, I felt. And you would use the feeling wheel. The feelings reminded me of. So it's going to remind you of a time, a prior experience. What did the feelings remind me of? Recalling that I think I needed. So it's going to point again to what did you need? What did you need in that past situation that you're recalling? These feelings are reminding you of. But I didn't get it, so you fill in the blank. I didn't get it. I didn't get what I needed, so it makes sense that I did that because. And here you're really validating your feelings. You're validating what you experienced. It makes sense that I did that because. And then here's part 2. This is big. The story that I tell myself, change feeling like loss, sadness, sorrow, grief is. What's the story I tell myself about change feeling so hard or difficult or feeling like loss? What's the story? The truth is, knowing this, I can try to reframe this story by, you add some way that you can help yourself reframe that story. If I do this, I may be more able. In this work, I'm learning that some of the stories I tell myself are. And one way I will show up for myself now is to, this is how you can really show up with self-compassion. So this live video will be a podcast on Wednesday. It will drop on Wednesday morning. So don't worry. I also will put a link to all of the slides in the podcast notes along with the writing prompts. So you'll have everything you need. And make sure you go get the goods. If you haven't already, get the roadmap. The way is through navigating hard emotions. letsfeelgoodnow.com/get the goods. And that is it, my friends. I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in a couple weeks. Bye now.